declared King of the Moon, coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. We have Mad Mercenary from a different continent. Hello, Mad Mercenary.
Hello.
And I think, unless he's somewhere quite different than his accent would suggest, I think that Apostolic Majesty would bring us to a third continental representation on the show.
Indeed, indeed. I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Apostolic Majesty. And in particular, let it be noted that just like every week, I try to stretch myself by, I don't know that I try, I just keep doing it. I stretch myself by taking things on that I feel like I'm scrambling to prep and get ready. Apostolic Majesty has very graciously agreed to work with us on this topic, which is not his area of specialty in more than one way. His particular area of specialty has more to do with political history of the continent. Is that a reasonable, very brief executive summary?
Yes, I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, and even back further in time, in fact, not necessarily like the political history of the 1990s, more like the 1790s or earlier, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So in a way, we're in the right time in what we're discussing today, but not exactly the right place. Also, this is really to do with economic history, which is something that AM has come to, so shall we say, later in your young life, right?
Oh, yes. Well, I think I'm just, because the topic's going to be capitalism and historians, so maybe this will actually be quite helpful. Just through osmosis, I didn't encounter anyone from the Austrian school who studied history in any serious capacity. It was only through AA that I was actually introduced to the Austrian school, of course, having a brief understanding of them through my own study of Austrian history, but not any deeper understanding as a result of, economic theory or anything like that. So right. Most of my understanding of economics actually came from Keynesians and Marxists through osmosis. And sadly, at the time, I wasn't interested enough in economic history to investigate their claims seriously. So, so right. Hopefully I'm slowly going to be liberated from that. But yes, my expertise are very much in foreign relations and political history. So
the way to frame this is that this is part of your journey. Right?
Absolutely.
That's what we're doing today. Yeah, which is okay. All right. So I guess the one thing I'd want to pitch before we really get in, I want to focus on the topic today. One thing I want to pitch is Subscribestar. I've just put the link in the chat. It's also in the show description. We've actually had a number of people joining us on there. It's $5 a month. I don't think I ever set any other brackets up or whatever. All you can do is give us $5 a month. Because, not looking to be a burden on anyone, but just a large number of modest donations starts to add up to something that really makes a difference. Oh, in fact, I think I can show you. Let's see here. Okay. I've switched my camera so you can see over in the corner if I get out of the way. You see that long, tall box. That is a massive green screen. I just got it and haven't even had a time to put it up yet. But that was purchased with the support of you all. So I wanted to show that to you and suggest that maybe I'll have it up by next week, hopefully. My life is very busy. But yeah, we are using the money to upgrade the show. And for me personally, most importantly, convince my wife that time spent on this is something that is worthwhile, which is very helpful. If any of you are married, you might understand what I'm talking about. Strangely, today, by coincidence, not a plan, I was in kind of the right era of history, but again, not the right place. I was visiting the Daniel Boone home with some of my children for a homeschool event today, and they were showing us various frontier, pioneer, how they worked with wood back then, and how you make butter, and this kind of stuff, right? This is actually, that period is not too far off from the period that we're interested in. Daniel Boone himself died in that home we visited today in 1820, but he was 85 at the time. His adventures that he was famous for were more the late 1700s, say, or a little bit before the very latest of the 1700s. That's when he was the first pioneer in Kentucky. And it had a lot to do with land, it seems, his life, as we were listening to the guide and everything. He loved land, he acquired it, he surveyed it, he moved further west for more of it. Very, very focused on land, which kind of makes sense, right? If you're a pioneer heading out into risk and danger away from civilization, it's in part because you're trying to stake a claim, make it your own, you know. So I'm sorry, did you have a comment on this?
No, I'm just happy to listen.
Yeah. So anyway, this is someone whose family, oh shoot, I already forgot. See, I know England so poorly that they'd said where his family was from and it already left my head. But anyway, his family was from England. His father had moved over. He was born in Virginia, I think. Or no, Pennsylvania. Sorry, born in Pennsylvania in 1850. Wait, I'm sorry. He died in 1820, so he was born 1734, I believe. 1734. So his life and times were roughly parallel to the period we're talking about, except that he was living, he and his many children were living the idyllic life that critics of the factory looked to. They were out on the land, in the sunshine, right? So anyway, I may come back to it, some of the things that come to mind as we talk. Okay, a couple things to highlight. The book we're going to focus on today is Capitalism and the Historians. It's edited by Hayek. And something, but we haven't talked about Hayek too much. He's not as hardcore as Mises and Rothbard in terms of economics and politics, I guess. Mises and Rothbard are famously very super consistent in their application of logic. And Hayek said he used the fox and hedgehog thing, which is the fox, which is the hedgehog. I guess he's the hedgehog. Anyway, Hayek famously was a little more, left more room for interpretation in his writings, shall we say, was more accommodating with things like certain aspects of the welfare state, which Rothbard and Mises had no sympathy for. But Hayek was brilliant, was able to draw from many sources because he knew a lot of languages. And he was in particular a great intellectual historian. I strongly recommend his writings on John Stuart Mill, for example, and many other, the early socialists, the so-called utopian socialists prior to Marx, are both enlightening and entertaining. So I don't know if you would know that about Hayek, but that might help you understand a little bit why he came to edit a book who the contributors of which were all historians. It's because he's got a guy who was greatly learned and had a great interest in history and intellectual history. And that's, we were already discussing this a little, that's part of what makes this book interesting. I did just drop the link to the book in there. Part of what makes this book interesting is that it's about what happened. And it's also about the story of what happened, the historiography, right? So we've got sort of two threads to follow here. Both what actually happened with the early factory system in England and what did people say about it and why did they say something about it. I wanted to share one more thing before we dive into Apostolic Majesty, sort of bracketing and setting the stage for us a bit here. I'm sharing a YouTube link. This is our friend Skeptical Waves, who has made this genius text-to-speech bot. I don't understand how he's done it, but it is, give it a listen if you've never heard any of his stuff. It is incredibly listenable. Text-to-speech, bot voices have been generally pretty annoying. It's been like, nice try, try listening to his and you'll be pretty impressed. He was like, hey, maybe I could throw that whole book together. And I was like, it's a long book. And we were just talking about it last night. I said, how about just the introduction by Hayek? It's actually a nice little essay that can stand on its own. And so that's what he did. So that might be something to put into your queue to take a listen to. And in fact, let's start, because it sets the stage so well, and it's just a brilliant points he makes. Apostolic Majesty, you're going to read to us the very beginning of the introduction, to the book, which Hayek titles History and Politics.
Absolutely. It's just a couple of pages, but it brilliantly sets out all of the issues which we're hopefully going to cover this evening. Political opinion and views about historical events ever have been and always must be closely connected. Past experience is the foundation on which our beliefs about the desirability of different policies and institutions are mainly based, and our present political views inevitably affect and colour our interpretation of the past. Yet, if it is too pessimistic a view that man learns nothing from history, it may well be questioned whether he always learns the truth. While the events of the past are the source of the experience of the human race, their opinions are determined not by the objective facts, by the records and interpretations to which they have access. Few men will deny that our views about the goodness or badness of different institutions are largely determined by what we believe to have been their effects in the past. There is scarcely a political ideal or concept which doesn't involve opinions about a whole series of past events, and there are few historical memories which do not serve as a symbol of some political aim. Yet the historical beliefs which guide us in the present are not always in accord with the facts. Sometimes there are even the effects rather than the cause of political beliefs. Historical myths have perhaps played nearly as great a role in shaping opinion as historical facts. Yet we can hardly hope to profit from the past experience unless the facts from which we draw our conclusions are correct. The influence which the writers of history thus exercise on public opinion is probably more immediate and extensive than that of the political theorists who launch new ideas. It seems as though even such new ideas which ride wider circles, usually not in their abstract form, but as the interpretation of particular events. The historian is in this respect at least one step nearer to direct power over public opinion than is the theorist. And long before the professional historian takes up his pen, current controversy about recent events will have created a definite picture, or perhaps several different pictures, of these events which will affect contemporary discussions as much as any division on the merits of new issues. This profound influence which current views about history have on political opinion is today perhaps less understood than it was in the past. One reason for this probably is the pretension of many modern historians to be purely scientific and completely free from all political prejudice. There could be no question, of course, that this is an imperative duty of the scholar insofar as historical research, that is, the ascertainment of the facts, is concerned. There is indeed no legitimate reason why, in answering questions of fact, historians of different political opinions should not be able to agree. But at the very beginning, in deciding which questions are worth asking, individual value judgments are bound to come in. And it is more than doubtful whether a connected history of a period or a set of events could be written without interpreting these in the light not only of theories about the interconnection of social processes, but also of definite values, or at least whether such a history would be worth reading. Historiography, as distinguished from historical research, is not only at least as much as an art as a science. The writer who attempts it without being aware of that his task is one of interpretation in the light of definite values also will succeed merely in deceiving himself and will become the victim of his unconscious prejudices. So I thought that, in a nutshell, sums up many of the issues. I mean, you could almost read that and become a complete pessimist, as being a historian is completely futile. Nevertheless, right. we'll endeavor to push on.
Well, I wanted to testify on a different topic, just very briefly, to what he's saying here when he talks about how our ideas about politics, and I would say, he doesn't say it here, but economics even, are often informed by historical myths, a story that's been told about the past. Because I found it startling the first time it happened when I was propounding some, I don't know, free market kind of view or something. And my grandmother got very angry because she said I was denigrating FDR and the New Deal, and he had saved them, with the New Deal. So that is, I was thinking I'm just talking about economic theory here. She came at me with history and a certain interpretation of what had happened. Events she had lived through, to be fair. But it was the history that was her response to my, shall we say, economic theory, right? But this applies just as well to ideas about politics. If you attack democracy, as I love to do, partially just to goad people, but also because I don't like it, then people are likely to respond with some kind of tell you that, you should be glad you're not speaking German or something, right? And that is the counter. It's an interpretation of what's happened in history that is the counter sometimes to a political or economic proposition. And it's startling when you first run into it, I think. I'm talking about when I was quite young, right? It's startling when you first run into it. I think it feels like a category mistake in a way, right? It's like saying, well, I think 2 + 2 = 4, and someone's saying, but have you, and someone bring up the Spanish Civil War, and you're like, what? Right? But we can laugh, but it is the reality that, as Hayek suggests here, people are picking up their ideas about economics and politics to a great degree from stories they're told about history. And the question, of course, is how accurate are those stories? And part of the reason I like this passage, I was going to read part of it before Apostolic Majesty suggested it, because it seems like, in part, it's a nice little manifesto for this channel, because, and probably AM's channel as well, for that matter, because as we found our groove and figured out what we're doing here, leaving aside, say, the minis where we kind of do current events, but in terms of the deep stuff, the Econ Lore Deep Chat, it's Deep Lore Econ Chat itself, we keep on ending up at history. At this point, we know it, and it's conscious, right? And I think it's for this very reason. It's because history informs how people think about things. So, as I often bring up, I thought one of our most exciting episodes was on the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages. This immediately throws into question a number of stories that we've been told from, say, Enlightenment type people, and people who paint the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, and so on and so forth, right? Well, that's sort of what I like, right? I want you to question these narratives that we've just been absorbed from in the air around us, and so revisionist history is, to some degree, a theme on the channel. Revisionist economic history, to be a little more narrow, right? But revisionist history, more broadly speaking, as well, to some degree. So anyway, a great passage. And I think it's fair to say, Apostolic Majesty, without giving too much away, it's really relevant to the particular period of history we're looking at. It seems like, reading through the book here, edited by Hayek, it's like half talking about what happened, and it's half talking about the people who were talking about what happened and why they were talking about it, right? You caught that, right? There was a heavy dose of historiography in this book.
Oh, absolutely. And, one could, I did infer a lot more historiography, because, of course, I think the edition I have was written in the 50s. I think you might have a later edition from the early 60s. And in terms of applying this, beyond capitalism to critical theory and the social historian, sort of going beyond this, this could be extended so much further. So yes, it's a very interesting topic. But in terms of moving on, would you like me to give a very brief overview of the era? Because
so let me try to bracket it a little. I think I should have paid more attention to dates as I went through the book, but I think it's sort of like 1790 to somewhere in the 1830s is sort of the central focus. Now, there's other things that happen with factory acts and so forth in the 1840s, the 1850s. It's not the end of the story in the 1830s, but I think the period that's really in contention, it's the period that Engels, I think, focuses on in his book on the topic. And a lot of the sort of myths of the Industrial Revolution, shall we say, they're really focused on something like this period, I think. So I thought it would be helpful for Apostolic Majesty to sort of set the stage a little bit, because it is, even though the Industrial Revolution, if you look it up, it talks about it being across Europe, across America, of course, not necessarily all at the same time, right? But we often look to England as sort of where we saw some of the things that became manifest globally first, right? So England becomes, specifically what was going on in England, what really was happening with the changeover to industry and so forth, as well as sort of what everybody was thinking about it and what was going on politically. It all ends up becoming like really relevant to disentangle the real story. So don't want to spend an hour on this, but let's make sure we start, I guess, with 1688. Sorry. Let me give one more, the economic history aspect, and then AM will go into the political history. So the Industrial Revolution is usually considered, if you look it up on Wikipedia, to go from about 1760 to sometime between 1820 and 1840. And so the period we're talking about is actually a little bit later than when the Industrial Revolution has started. As usual, something starts and people don't really, it's a gradual thing, right? People don't, somebody didn't on January 1st, 1760, hold up a sign and say, now we enter the Industrial Revolution. Slowly over time, people started noticing that things were changing from how we used to do them, right? Until by, I think, the early 1800s, it's really obvious to everyone that something epic is going on. And that's when we start seeing parliamentary discussions about it and books being written about it, and what are the conditions of the workers in these newfangled factories, but it's been building before that. So for example, Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations talks about the pen factory and the division of labor and the making of a pen and so forth. His book's published in 1776, so it's, I think, well before anybody is worried about children in factories or something. The changeover is actually happening on the ground. So to some degree, we're not exactly looking at the earliest we could look at in terms of the economic changes. It's more the period where people started paying attention, if you follow me, right?
Yes,
Go ahead.
and another thing which we're probably going to discuss is how the sensitivity to these issues is one of the prominent things that we would come across, as opposed to these issues declining. So yes, just to give like a broad context, you've already set up the Industrial Revolution, of course, starts around the 1750s, 1760s. It only expands to Europe in the 1830s, and I believe Belgium is the next country to industrialize. But just to set up the unique situation in England, in 1688, of course, as Radlib mentioned, there was the Glorious Revolution. And this established essentially parliamentary almost supremacy over the king, in the sense that the king would exercise very little executive control except over the issue of foreign affairs. And this led to a period known as the Whig domination of British history, which would exist throughout most of the 18th century. By the time we get to Napoleonic Wars, the kings have basically been forced out of any real position. I think the last sort of king to exercise any sort of real executive power was George III, and much of his personal prestige was lost due to the loss of the American colonies. Of course, you all know all about that, Radlib. But getting on to the political environment, because it is a political environment that goes in tandem with the economic environment. Of course, in 1789 in France, there is the French Revolution. And the ideas of socialism or proto-socialism really are the result of the French Revolution. One can't distance themselves from them. On the one hand, you have the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which again, you can say are bound up in this romanticism of the return to the state of nature. And this, again, could be related to themes of deindustrialization. And later on, of course, you have theorists such as Babeuf and Lecomte de Saint-Simon, and, of course, the more utopian socialists in Britain under Robert Owen, who will pioneer this new method of thinking. In terms of like the direct sort of predecessor to this period, so in terms of like our understanding of English history, I believe it's 1820, which is the year where the actual conditions of the working classes actually begin to improve drastically. And that continues throughout most of the 19th century. Industrialization didn't lead to instantaneous improvements for the working classes, from 1760 until 1820. And I think even later into the 1830s, things were stagnating. But we have the situation in the Napoleonic Wars. And to put this in perspective, Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolutionary Wars lasted from 1792 all the way up until 1815. And as a result of that, Britain established itself as the supreme maritime power all across the globe. It was essentially unchallenged. France had been humbled as the main continental power, and financially, Britain was unquestionably powerful in terms of its economic policy. The Whig and sort of Tory establishment, this political government, centering on Parliament, was just about to increase with the 1832 Reform Act. And into this mix, we have things such as the Peterloo Massacre in, I think it's 1817. Am I right there?
I don't know.
I'd be wrong. Which is, seen as one of the focal events of these social historians in terms of creating a working class consciousness. And it's into this environment that we have, the
1819.
1819. So
it's Peterloo. Yeah.
We have the innovations in the expansion of the factory system, the expansion of the population, and that's where we get to our period now. So really, unless you have any sort of more questions, I think there's also one other important factor, which is more of a continental issue, but also has ramifications for Britain, which is the rise of Romanticism. And Romanticism is as much a reactionary attack on the French Revolution as much as an attack on industrialization. And it comes in the form of the conservative attack, and you can say nostalgia for agrarianism in the medieval era.
So I'm sorry, when is that period that Romanticism is really rising?
Romanticism really sort of comes into the fore around sort of the Baedeker sort of period, so 1820s until about 1850. Yeah, between.
Right. So why is this key? This is key because one of the attacks on the factories is that basically people are inside buildings, I guess, generally. I mean, probably not always, but the general picture is that people are inside a building working, as opposed to gambling about in nature, occasionally, doing some light farm work, which is a strange picture of actual farm work for anyone who's had a taste of it. But it does seem to come out of this romantic view. Am I being unfair?
Perhaps a little unfair, but yes, this nostalgia comes out of the Romantics in the early 19th century. And I do think it's this intellectual environment that breeds this sentimentalism and desire to react against the conditions of the factories. And again, this is mainly just happening in Britain at this time because, for example, the Industrial Revolution in France has very little in terms of coal and iron reserves. I mean, most of it is in East France. So France industrialized much later. Germany would begin to industrialize, I think, in around the 1850s, and its main sort of phase of industrialization would happen after unification, after 1870. So yes, Britain, and you mentioned Engels. Engels, I think, wrote his Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1844. I think this is around the same time that A Christmas Carol is published. It's around the same time that Disraeli's novel Sybil and the Two Nations is published. So really sort of 1830 till about 1850, you can say the epoch of the industrial age. And then, of course, in the 1870s, we have the Great Depression. This is the period where most of this sentimentalism and most of this concern for the working conditions arises. Right.
But crucially, what I kept seeing in the book is that they're not necessarily, people don't seem to feel bound to talk about what they actually know and have seen themselves, shall we say. It seems like folks feel free to comment on conditions that they themselves have not observed and conditions that are in the past, right? So they're looking back and maybe projecting into the past, current conditions or just their idea of what it was like back then without necessarily good on the ground evidence.
There's a wonderful excerpt from, I believe it's I think it is the Hayek chapter, the Hayek introduction. I think it's important that, as we sort of elucidated, there is this leftist movement which is arise from the French Revolution, and there are already these utopian socialists in the form of Robert Owen. However, in tandem to this, there is the conservative reaction to the Corn Law League, which is advocating for free trade, in Britain across the empire. And the main argument in favor of the Corn Law, Corn Laws being repealed, of course, is cheaper foodstuffs to break the privileges of the English landed gentry. And of course, that opposition was actually led from the Conservative backbenchers, because it was the Conservative Prime Minister, Robert Peel, who was pushing for the repeal of the Corn Laws. And that was led by, among others, Benjamin Disraeli. But there's an interesting thing here, a little statement by from A Brief History of the Rise and Progress of the Anti-Corn Law, written by Reuben in 1845, which talks about how this conservative opposition would actually evolve into a metropolitan leftist Marxist opposition, which relied on this premise, which was the historical myth. And it's not too long, but I think it's worth reading.
Please, yeah.
I need not remind you of the statements put forward in the newspapers relative to the miserable conditions of the operatives and tyranny of their masters, for they made such an impression on me that it was with reluctance that I consented to go to Lancashire. Indeed, these, and again, Lancashire and Liverpool were the centre of industrialisation at this time.
Manchester? Where's Manchester?
Manchester is very close to Liverpool.
Okay, got it. So Liverpool, Manchester is in one part of England, and then the Lancashire area, these are both where you've got a lot of factories being built.
Now, I might be wrong again, because again, my knowledge on economic history is poor, but I think the first ever railway was constructed between Liverpool and Manchester in the early 1830s.
Right,
and
to facilitate the probably doing production of one part of the process in one place, shipping it over to the other, finishing it up, that kind of thing. Right?
Yes, exactly. And of course, Liverpool was a major port.
Right.
These misrepresentations are quite general, and people believe them without knowing why or wherefore. As an instance, just before starting, there was a large dinner party, and again, this is anecdotal. This is from a quote by Mrs. Cook Taylor. At the west end of the town, and seated next to a gentleman who was considered a very clever and intelligent man. In the course of the conversation, I mentioned that I was going to Lancashire. He stared and asked, what on earth could take me there? That he would soonest think as going to St. Giles. That was a horrid place, factories all over, that the people from starvation, oppression and overwork had almost lost the form of humanity, and that the mill owners were a bloated, pampered race, feeding on the very vitals of the people. I answered that this was a dreadful state of affairs, and asked in what part he had seen such misery. He replied he had never seen it, but had been told it existed, and for that part he was never going to visit the manufacturing districts, and that he never would. The gentleman was one of a very numerous body of people who spread reports without talking or taking the trouble of inquiring if they be true or false. Now that I have seen the factory people at work in their cottages and in the schools, I am totally at a loss to the account for the outcry that has been made against them. They are better clothed, better fed, and better conducted than many other working class people. And of course, she's primarily referring to the agrarian working classes at that time.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to jump to the conclusions too quickly, but that passage and a number of others I saw, it kept making me think of our modern term of virtue signaling. Now, I don't know that maybe that's a little anachronistic, but and maybe there's a better term, but this phenomenon of, I associate it with the movie Sex, Lies, and Videotape. I may be the only one, but this phenomenon of I'm going to express a lot of emotion and concern about something that is remote from me, where remote might mean that, those poor starving children in Africa, or as in this context, it could mean those people who are over there in some part of England that I've never visited and are in circles that I'm not in, right? Because in particular for the Tories, it seems, if I'm getting this right, AM, the Tories are a landowning class and they're tied to agriculture. And so if they have any connection at all, and who knows how much they did, right? How distant they were from the people on the ground actually working the land and so forth. But if they were to have a connection, it would be, say, to agricultural workers and the process of agriculture. So they're the ones criticizing the rising industry, but they're not necessarily particularly involved with it.
Well,
right?
this is the contradiction of the Peel-like government, because on the one hand you have Peel, who was very familiar with industrialization, who was advocating for free trade, and then you have the Conservative Party proper, which was massively opposed to this. And of course, moving on into political history, Peel would have to resign the premiership, and his faction, known as the Peelites, would then go over and join the Whig, which would later become the Liberal Party, and the Conservative Party would later become the party of Benjamin Disraeli, who would take it back to power in a majority in 1874. So yes, it's complicated to say the least, but that's the situation in the immediate sort of 1840s.
Right, but my point is, right, this division between some people just literally don't know much about what's happening with this rising industrial thing. And I don't want to be unfair here, totally uncharitable. They didn't necessarily have a reason to know about it in their daily lives, right? It was a sort of a new phenomenon. It did seem to be in certain parts of England, I gather. I don't think there were factories in the heart of London, right? Or being opened up on the traditional landed estates. I mean, at the beginning, the factories are sort of literally geographically sort of segregated from just the places that some of these people would be. Mm-hmm. Does that seem right to you?
Yes, I think there are a little pushback against that. Is
okay.
Again, I'm just playing devil's advocate because again, Disraeli is probably one of my sort of semi-strengths, so to speak. But many of his books, including The Two Nations, were actually based on material that Disraeli had garnered from the Royal Commissions. And it's from these Royal Commissions, which again are state reports, state investigations into this period, which gives us the image of these towns, and much cherry picking was going on in terms of acquiring certain information from these reports. And it's from these reports which Disraeli decided to base his novel Sybil and the Two Nations. However, one of the historians in this book, T.S. Ashton, makes the claim that not that these conditions didn't exist, but simply that they were assigning these troubles to the wrong group, i.e. it wasn't the proletariat who were having the worst of these conditions, but it was the continuation of the customs, conditions, and habits of the 18th century in various domestic work and remote villages where earnings were at their lowest. So again, contrasting against this romantic idyll of like a return to the countryside.
This novel you keep bringing up by Disraeli, I assume you don't just bring it up because of your fondness or knowledge or whatever of Disraeli. I assume it actually made a splash. It had an influence.
Absolutely. In the same way that the Charles Dickens novels made a splash. And I think, again, this is more like a focus on history, but I think it's also important to note that literature has also created a huge impact on popular memory. And this, again, is, you talked earlier about how, was it your mother who was offended by your economic critique?
My grandmother who lived through it,
would offend FDR. I think this is where we have to draw the line between like historical memory and the actual pursuit of academic history. And this, what complicates it further, is that the myths are permeated into the culture as well as within the academic history itself.
Right. You get it in movies, you get it in books. It's just at a certain point, the story, the myth, whatever, it's just assumed. It's not even like the point of, in a book or something. It's not even the point of it anymore. Like with it sounds like with Dickens and Disraeli, to some degree, they were actually, this was sort of a forward aspect of what they were writing about, right? It was sort of a key component. Eventually, it's not that anymore. It's just you set a story in that time and you just assume that this is the way it was, and that's just your background, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
It's just and explicit, as opposed to like making a big point of it. Well, obviously the factories were terrible. You're not even arguing the point. I mean, everybody knows eventually, right?
Mm. And for Disraeli in particular, this would become the basis of a political manifesto, which would become One Nation conservatism. But of course, this wasn't just again related to the left either. I mean, in the same chapter by Ashton, he discusses how, many of the contemporary historians of that period, and again, this is where we get economic history, and again, principally economic history from Marx. You could say, depressingly, Marx is probably in the intellectual sphere had more impact on history than any other subject. And many of the most prominent historians today still, even if they're completely blissfully unaware of it, owe much of their understanding, their dialectic, to Marx, even though one can say, actually, no, Hegel was the principal influence behind Marx. But nevertheless, his economic analysis, that of the progression of economic systems, from feudalism to capitalism and ultimately to socialism, has had a colossal impact, and it's been transferred into many, different schools, critical theory, cultural Marxism, etc., beyond the original economic aspects. And within the pursuit of history, I mentioned that Disraeli had a political agenda to push. He mentions, Ashton mentions other historians such as Arnold Toynbee, not the Arnold Toynbee who was a distinguished professor of international relations in history, who published a study of history, but his uncle, who was both a social reformer and a historian on the Industrial Revolution. So there was a social policy aspect which was wedded into the work, i.e., the work, you could say, was ancillary to achieving a certain sort of political goal, which was, welfare in the factories, rather than, again, having this scientific detached attitude, which, hopefully one would expect from historians. Moving on from the Marxism angle, what Ashton also discusses is many elements of historical schools, what this spawned. And one historian he mentions is Werner Sombart and the German historical schools. So we're talking about Bruno Hildebrand, we're talking about Max Weber, of course, very famously in the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And they would, on the one hand, claim to be empirical and concerned with rejecting economic theorems, yet on the other hand, most of its members would be social policy advocates, and they would even talk to themselves as Kathedra Sozialisten, socialists of the chair. So on the one hand, there is this appeal to objectivity, and it's the same with the Frankfurt School and Horkheimer. On the one hand, you're claiming to be liberated from all of these political dogmas. On the one hand, you're basically pushing Marxism.
Right. Yeah, and just a side note, not something to get into now. I don't know if we'll ever get into it, but the original opponent of the Austrian school prior to Keynesians or Paul Krugman or, the various opponents that we've had over the last 150 years now, I guess. The original opponent was the German historical school. Not so much Max Weber, who I feel like is close to the Austrians in certain respects. But others of the German historical school, I gather, were, when it came to economics, were particularly hostile to economic theory. And of course, the policies that would come out of good economics didn't go so well with socialists of the chair, right? So anyway, that's a whole rabbit hole I don't want to get into now, but it is just, if you find the Austrian school interesting, it's a matter of history that some of the original, maybe the first thing published, one of the first two books published by Karl Munger was really a response to the German historical school, explaining why economic theory was a thing, in contradiction of what their claim was. He was basically defending the idea of economic theory, which may sound kind of weird to our listeners, but to this day, there are people who are suspicious of the idea that there can even be such a thing as economic theory, as opposed to just specific things that happen at specific times under certain conditions. In other words, there's just nothing but history is kind of where the German historical school would be coming from. Is that somewhat fair to them?
Well, yes, that's in theory that would be the case, but on the one hand, you have Werner Sombart, which represents the again, because of the divisions within the school, of course, who represented the youngest of the German historical school, And there is a quote within the book: "Facts are like beads; they require a string to hold them together. No theory, no history." And obviously that's in contradiction to that remark. Nevertheless, the string that they would thread the beads together would invariably be Marxism. So
right. And so that statement was Sombart?
Yeah.
That you were quoting? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So Sombart's giving something closer to the Mises's book, Theory and History. It's just that his theory is different. But he would emphasize the importance of a need for theory.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, but right, that's later. Probably be after Karl Manger's tangling with the German historical school, I'm guessing. Perhaps. I don't know. Anyway, okay, so we're going to come back to the historiography. But first, nothing ever dies in the political economy and history and so forth. Things don't seem to die. They just come back around again. It's like fashions and clothing, people dressing like hippies again, or whatever. So similarly to, I read this book. It's noted here that I first read this book February 28th, 1999. So I actually reread it for this because it'd been so long. But it's just been amazing to me the past couple of years getting involved with sort of conservative or right-wing, whatever you want to call them, some folks in circles on YouTube and so forth, to hear some of the kind of the sort of takes that you have the Tories giving of the Industrial Revolution. It feels like I'm hearing echoes of that now. One might mention carrot pillars, but you'd have to go to Academic Agent's channel to have any sense of what that is referring to. Anyway, so I read through this whole thing, and then I was like, man, I should have just started at the end, because in terms of not so much the historiography, but the a little bit more of like what actually were the conditions, the working class conditions and stuff. Yeah. The final chapter by W.H. Hutt was particularly valuable. I was really struck by how much good stuff there was. So I actually wanted to start with the most emotional thing. The final chapter is called The Factory System of the Early 19th Century. And that is to talk about the children, right? Because above all, and I don't know if it's different in England, AM, but above all, at least what I've absorbed over here in the U.S., it's the children were in the factories and it was terrible. That's Absolutely. if you ask for somebody to give you like an executive summary of like what was wrong with the Industrial Revolution, that's what they'd tell you. The children.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right? It's the same over there. Yeah.
Same over there. Yeah, right. So I felt like let's just cut to the chase and share a little bit. He talks about the charge that factory work produced deformities and stunted growth in children, right? Of course, this sort of romantic sort of idea that, the children were so much happier when they were out in the sunshine and so forth, doing hard manual labor on the farm, but they didn't necessarily emphasize that part of it. And then something that he brings in, which I think maybe has been lost to time a bit, but I think is key to understanding where they're coming from at this time, is that there's a concern about moral degradation.
Yeah,
the children are going to the factories. It's not good for like their health and their well-being, right? They should be out in the fields playing or something. But also, it's a morally degrading environment for them. And that seems to be around the 1830s, 1840s. There seems to be sort of a fashion that blows through where suddenly there's a lot of concern about, the morals of the working class. Did you pick up on that, AM, in your own?
Oh, yes. It's a constant theme with, I can say derisively, the bourgeois Victorian mentality. But yes, it's the moralizing zeal is, quintessentially Victorian.
And I haven't shared this yet with him. I took a screenshot of it to share. But sorry, just ran across it. It's not on the children thing. But this one's going to be for the Britisher. He talks about someone saying that tea drinking was condemned as a sign of demoralization.
Oh, yes.
So I'm going to share this with the Britisher and say, I figured out why you're so degenerate, British. So let me just read the passage for your amusement. Under any circumstances, we should deprecate the too liberal use of weak tea as extremely debilitating to the stomach, but the practice is fatal to the constitution of all hard-working men. It affords a temporary relief at the expense of a subsequent reaction, which in its turn calls for another and stronger stimulus. So I think if I'm getting the language right there, he's saying that tea is a gateway drug. What's it a gateway drug to? This led to the mixing of gin in the tea. So like the tea gives you a little hit, and then it leaves you wanting more, right? So you got to add some gin to it. A practice which prevailed, quote, to an inconceivable extent among our manufacturing population. And he says, Hutt says, this is no attempt to ridicule by a carefully chosen passage from a crank. This opinion was quite common. And he cites someone else who said exactly the same thing in almost the same words the following year. The concern about tea being degenerating you or whatever. So anyway, I thought that was great fun. Okay, so what is the actual condition of the children? I tried to quickly highlight some of the concerns. And it's quite interesting because something he's able to do is to call upon some people who were hostile to the factory system, but were people who went and actually made observations and were relatively, honest about what they saw, right? And in fact, I sort of got things backwards because what you find is that when these people are hostile to the factory system, they go and they check, what is it like for these children? They find that it's not so bad. And then what is the grounds upon which they condemn it anyway? It's on these moral degeneracy grounds. This is a morally degenerate environment. Actually, their work conditions aren't that bad, but we just don't like them being in this environment because of our bourgeois moral concerns or whatever, right? So it says here that they questioned some doctors. I think this is the Lord's Committee of 1818. They questioned some doctors, and the doctors had practical experience of manufactories, had observed children and employed in them. And their evidence generally suggested that whatever the hours factory children were actually working at that period, they were at least as healthy as children not employed in factories. And then, they press them. It talks about them, questioning the doctor, well, but aren't there too many hours that could be worked? And he says, well, I don't know. I'm just telling you that from what I observed, whatever hours they're working, they seem fine. Their health seems okay. Let's see, here's one who, sorry, I need to get my Dr. Turner, right? I think. Yeah, Dr. Turner Thackeray, not spelled like Thackeray, the historian or whatever, or the novelist, I think, right? Thackrah, R-A-H at the end. Anyway, he wrote The Effects of the Principal Arts, Trades, and Professions on Health and Longevity. He opposed child labor with considerable warmth, whether inside or outside the factories. That's interesting. On the ground that the term of physical growth ought not to be a term of physical exertion. So he thinks that basically if your body is still growing, you haven't reached physical maturity, then manual labor is going to stunt your growth or something.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've heard anyone ever. I don't know that there's anything to that. Let's put it that way. And it said, even so, though, he was unable to represent the health of the operatives. I don't know why they use this term. It seems to just mean the workers. The health of the workers who had been through it as in any way worse than that of most other classes of the community, even of the more wealthy classes. So at least from a pure physical health point of view, moral effects aside, the doctors who actually go and check on the children seem to find that they're doing okay. Now one thing that gets confusing is that there are classes of people that do seem to be having a rougher time of it. It's not all the gains in the gains, as AM was saying earlier, the gains to the working class aren't necessarily immediate, and they aren't necessarily evenly distributed. So for some reason, and I wish I knew more about the work to be able to explain it better, but handloom weavers come up more than once in this book. Evidently, being a handloom weaver, that was a crap job. You did not want to be a handloom weaver.
Yeah, I think that was due to the level of accidents that were caused by the machinery.
Okay, injuries on the job. I see.
Mm-hmm.
So they were dangerous machines, and so on. And so okay. So he Gaskell, a medical man, he says it was quite clear that apart from the effect on the handloom weavers, the factories had resulted in abundant material progress, and that the wages of cotton operatives, with proper economy and forethought, would enable them to live comfortably, nay, in comparative luxury. In fact, that brings up a whole different set of concerns they have. Again, sort of lost to time. Listen to this. This is quite interesting. Thackeray lamented the fact that children were no longer contented with plain food, but must have dainties. Now, understand, he's saying that he's really concerned about this, right? Mm. The Reverend G.S. Bull deplored the tendency of girls to buy pretty clothes ready-made from shops instead of making them themselves, as this practice unfitted them to become the mothers of children. And then Gaskell goes on about the decadence in tobacco, the moral decline in the growth of workmen's combinations. I think that refers to unions, or something like that, right? The men were no longer respectful and attentive to their superiors. So, as Hutt says here, it is but one case of the kind of argument which we constantly find intended to prove that moral degradation had resulted from the factories, and illustrated by examples which could quite easily suggest to us economic and social advance. So this is a very interesting phenomenon. I think I've seen it in my own life. Sometimes it seems like there's a, how do I put this? It's not I don't know if snobbery is quite the word, but basically a class of people who are used to certain things, their children probably get dainties, I'm guessing, right? Somehow they condemn that when they see it happening among the hoi polloi.
Oh yeah.
Right. What do you call this phenomenon, AM? I mean, I feel it's so familiar to me. I've seen it in my life. I see them talking about it here. Oh, yeah,
just a word for it, snobbery.
Maybe that's it. Maybe it's also evidently from sociology types. They say that this issue of distinguishing yourself.
Oh yes, like sumptuary conditions. Wanting to establish strict patterns of clothing and practice that that distinguish you as a class. Yes,
exactly. Yeah, this is evidently a big factor throughout history, as far as I can tell. But certainly in the last several hundred years, you see many examples where the concern is to make it clear that I'm up here and you're down there. And the problem with economic progress is that can blur the lines, right? Yeah. Because now the thing that, quick bit of the actual, what did the Industrial Revolution actually do? Well, what it effectively did is things that were only available to people who could pay someone to handcraft something, started to become available to the masses because they could be produced in quantity in a factory, all right, to cut it short. And it particularly had to do with clothing, with, they don't call it pottery, but, pots. This is some of the early advances in the Industrial Revolution have to do with mass producing things, where in the past, if you were lower class, say a gentleman, for example, or not a gentleman, a man, a worker, you would have a suit and it might have been passed to you from your father and you would mend it and keep it going like your whole life.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas to us, that's just, even for a poor person in our country now in the United States and the United Kingdom, you couldn't really imagine that you would just keep a suit going and pass it to your child, right? They would just buy their own, or you would probably have replaced that, the role that suit played in your life. You'd replace it a couple times in the course of your life, even if you did take care of things nicely. So this transition of the laborers from not being able to afford these things, where the richer folks, the landowners and so forth, they would be able to pay to have someone handcraft a suit for them, say. The labor couldn't really afford that, right? Well, then the Industrial Revolution comes along, and they start using factory methods to mass produce. And now you've got someone who's sort of a regular Joe who has a nice new suit that wasn't passed down to him from his father. Right?
Oh, yes, there's a wonderful segment in this book which I think complements that quite well in terms of again trying to impose a Marxist theory of exploitation onto this. Ashton quotes a Frederick Louis Nussbaum, who was writing in 1933, who believed that the factory of mass production was actually to meet the demands of the princes and the industrialists, i.e., for their own personal gain, in terms of the production, the sort of good that was being produced. And this apparently in 1800 included chocolate, lace, embroidery, tapestries, porcelains, and jewelry, all of which weren't being produced in 1800. But also, I love this idea, this quote, that this historian believes that his fellows were making fine muslins and cambrics for royal courts and not calicos for English workers and the peasants of India. Again, just another little myth that the mass production didn't actually facilitate, general improvements in the condition of the working classes. Rather, there has to be some sort of narrative of exploitation going on.
Right, and so again, just in a capsule form, what is the Industrial Revolution? Why is it called a revolution? Why is it a big deal? It's because we already had the production of things for the rich. I don't know that the Industrial Revolution produced anything new for quite some time. That is, produced something that hadn't already been produced previously.
Yeah,
it was literally just the production process made it so that you could now have a cheaper, a more affordable version of that thing.
Yes, there's probably one thing. Yes, one thing to mention, which probably was specifically for the middle classes, and I think actually industrialization actually aids in its mythological demise, so to speak, because one of the things being produced en masse is now the books are now being published en masse. Right. We have industrial printmakers and not little artisanal printmakers now. So right. That's one of the ironies coming out of this as well, that it's this diffusion of information and fiction. Which is created by the Industrial Revolution, which is also condemning the Industrial Revolution. Yeah,
which immediately turns on what allows Dickens to publish on a scale that no author had seen before in the history of the world, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, one of the great, side note here, one of the great concerns of Dickens was that he didn't have the intellectual property protection in the United States that he did have in the UK. And he was quite popular in the United States. So he finally figured out how to monetize. He went over and he did readings, and he sold tickets to hear him read portions from his novels or whatever. And by that time, his novels had been promulgated in cheap copies, right? One's not authorized by him. So he was well known. He was actually able to make money. That's a whole intellectual property thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So the children, right? So the ones who actually look into their situation, to summarize, they find that their working conditions don't seem so bad, just in terms of health and safety kinds of things for the time, right? I mean, no doubt that if we could time travel and go back to 1802 into a factory where children are working for 10 hours or whatever, no more than 10. The 10 hours was their big push to get it down to 10 hours, right? So working for more than 10 hours, we'd be appalled, right? And we'd be like, oh, I wouldn't want my child doing that. Having said that, in the context of the times, in the context of what working life was like in other spheres, in agriculture and so forth, in mining, shall we say, then, they took a look and they were like, these kids are doing okay, relative to the general condition. One footnote, I think, I don't know that I can find it, but the thing about being deformed, I don't know if I can find it again, but he mentions that, in fact, I want to, because this is good. Yeah. he mentions that deformities were just a general issue at the time. And at least this one guy in 1834, he said he blamed the practice of swaddling and bandaging infants more than anything else for the presence of deformities. That is, there were a lot of deformities, but they were just generally in the population, he thinks, from a certain childcare practice that was prevalent at the time. He didn't think it could be tracked specifically to working in factories, that there was deformities or stunted growth or anything like that. So only thing left to do on the child front, I think, is to mention that they were eventually replaced by Irish. Now, this is getting a little later than the period I wanted to focus on, but just to sort of finish the tale here, the wages that the children were making were lower than an adult worker would make. Nevertheless, evidently, the Irish were in such a bad situation that it was working for them to come over and take those jobs. In particular, the factory acts were being put into place before, say, the 1830s, but I saw a note that it was really only in 1833 that they started to be enforced in any kind of way. So they were passing laws, but it wasn't really making any changes on the ground. In 1833, they actually basically started sticking inspectors into factories or something, and the rules started being followed, And so the children were being limited in how many hours they worked, and so it became less attractive to have your child working in these jobs because they weren't making as much, right? It limited how much they could make. But the Irish gladly came and took the jobs that the families were starting to take their children away from. And then that brings a whole nother round of look at the degeneracy in these factories, because I guess the behavior of the Irish, I don't know. You're English, so you can freely indulge in anti-Irish tropes, right, A.M.?
I can, but I'm also Irish.
Oh, you are? Okay. So you mean you are personally actually a mix?
I'm personally a mix, yes.
Oh, okay.
So I'll be indulging a little bit of self-hate there.
Right. But perhaps you can give us some context for why the influx of Irish immigrants would be viewed as, lowering the tone in some way.
Two reasons come to mind. The old adage of the Irish being excessive drinkers, one. The Irish being essentially being incredibly poor compared to the population of England, because of course most of the Irish were tenant farmers, and their condition was much worse than the comparable situation in England, but also because they were Catholic as well. But in terms of the and of course England is principally a Protestant Anglican country, and I think it also an important point to note that many of the Whigs, i.e. the predominant movement which would lead to the Liberal Party, which would become one of the dominant political forces in the 19th century, it comes out of the spirit of not only just Protestantism but non-conformism as well. So the Methodist movement will later become in some cases the Baptist movement and the Presbyterian movements, etc., the Quakers. All of these movements are supporting the Whigs and supporting the liberal movements, but invariably many of them are also anti-Catholic. I mean, you mentioned 1688. One of the cases was the Whigs were very happy pushing for religious freedom, except for Catholics. So this prejudice was quite severe, especially in the 18th century, where there had just been a series of Irish rebellions just before the Act of Unification, which was, I think, in 1800. Which created the United Kingdom. So yes, Ireland was in an unhappy situation, and one of the consistent, policies towards Ireland have been, trying to pacify it. This is, the great task which Gladstone would set himself to and would be defeated, and it ultimately came to revolve around the issue of home rule, which of course also failed, and of course we lead to the unhappy situation where Ireland is no longer part of the United Kingdom today.
So. Yeah, I mean, so to some degree, and there's a lot that you brought there, but to some degree, it sounds like they're just the ones maybe coming over. It's a self-selected group, I guess. If you're doing okay in Ireland, you're probably not going over and taking a child's job in the factory in England, right?
Absolutely not. Yeah.
So Yeah, so there's a self-selected group, and so they're poor enough that this looks like an attractive alternative to them.
And of course, they were starving as well.
Right.
Because this is the period of the potato famine. So I can't think of the numbers, but I think 2 million. Ireland had a population of about 8 million in 1840. Just to put this in perspective, I think that is now larger still than the combined population of Northern and Southern Ireland today. And
Whoa.
yes, and I believe 2 million emigrated and 2 million died, leaving the population of around 4 million. So it was one of the greatest catastrophes of the 19th century.
Wow, just incredible. Okay, so okay, so that's the condition of the children. Another thing that comes to mind, I'm just trying to think through the things that were covered in the book that are sort of the why people have a bad impression of the Industrial Revolution. Another one is the way that people were living, right? People are coming from the rural areas into the urban areas, but in particular the places like Manchester and Birmingham, right? And is that right, Birmingham? Did I?
Yeah, Birmingham, yes, will be industrialized quite later. I think
okay.
What's also the effect of this, of course, this leads to a large amount of political agitation. I mean, you mentioned Liverpool as well. I think Liverpool became so overrun by the Irish that they actually produced an Irish Home Rule MP in Liverpool.
Wait, I'm sorry. What does that mean? An Irish Home Rule MP?
Yes. Well, after the collapse of the Liberal Party in Ireland in the 1870s, a party group which was advocating for basically devolution for Ireland, so they would have their own parliament. And there were so many Irish in Liverpool that Liverpool actually returned a Irish Home Rule MP in Liverpool in England. Yeah,
I see. Which you would normally only have expected to come from Ireland itself, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha. I see. Right. So the living conditions of the workers, and this is a perennial issue, right? I mean, I've seen pictures of from Mexico City, present day Mexico City, and so forth. You have people, for one reason or another, leaving the idyllic rural existence and coming to the cities for work or opportunity or whatever. And sometimes their living conditions are not so nice to see. Now, one thing to bring up right away, and I don't know how much weight to put on it, but one thing to bring up right away is just the visibility of the working class, that when they're spread out in the countryside in across a large amount of land, you just don't see a lot of them at once. I mean, yes. I know it sounds kind of crude, but
right? No, I think this is very fair. Yeah.
Yeah. But then they come to the cities, and now you see, I don't know what a tenement is, but they always use the word tenement when talking about things like this. You see the tenement building or whatever, and now there's a whole bunch of them, and they're all sort of in one place, and so they're just more visible.
Yes, I think one issue you bring up is actually housing. I mean, housing was a major concern, and it was again used as a pretext again to denigrate the result of industrialization. All of these and I think maybe another thing that would be important to talk about eventually will be the enclosure movement. But again, the Marxist assumption is you have many people which are forced off the land due to the enclosure movement, becoming basically landless and disenfranchised. So they're forced into the city. They are packed into these slums, and they basically become, subhuman, sardines living in a rabbit warren, etc. However, what I found quite interesting reading the book is how many of these, you could say the shortfalls in construction were actually the result of excessive tariffs on certain building materials as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. And when these were let up, the actual condition of housing in Britain, improved, drastically. And this period of what was called the jerry builders, the short-term makeshift buildings which would collapse very easily in a storm and kill many people, were actually a constant theme throughout the 18th century as well. And this actually began to go away very quickly at the height of the Industrial Revolution, so around 1850 onwards. But again, the conception of these, overpacked slums in Victorian Britain is again one of the indelible images we have. But again, it was something that was already phasing out by the 1820s and was increasingly less by the 1830s.
I teased this on Twitter. Bertrand de Jouvenel makes a remarkable point that fits nicely with me visiting the Daniel Boone home today. He's giving Marx's view, and he says the nascent capitalist found already at hand a population which had been treated as tools by previous exploiters before being seized by the enterprising bourgeois, and the existence of a proletariat which could be treated in such a way originated in the expropriation of the farmers. This is what obliged the workers, bereft of their own means of production, to work for others who disposed of such means. So the idea is the workers had a means of production, land, right, where they could do agriculture. It was taken from them, and therefore they were just sitting there waiting for the factories to pull in, right?
Yeah.
Bertrand de Jouvenel makes a very interesting point after this that I've never heard. He says, if this theory, obviously inspired by the enclosures, were true, because remember, Marx is not here speaking specifically of the conditions in England, but making a general claim, right? If this theory, obviously inspired by the enclosures, were true, capitalism would have found it most difficult to obtain wage slaves in the countries where land was most readily available. For example, in the United States. So I'm thinking about this today, right? As I'm out there reading about how when the Boones, Nathan Boone, it was his home actually, that his father lived in near the end of his life. Nathan Boone and Daniel Boone came to Missouri, and at that time it was under Spanish governorship, and they each were given like 400 acres or something. You can only imagine what that might have seemed like to an English peasant.
And that's incredible. I think, again, just to put this in perspective, if I'm right, I think the population of 1850s America was around, I think, 25 to 30 million people. Is that around correct? From 1850 to 1860?
I don't know. I'll check, but go ahead.
And the population of the UK, I think, was around 40 million. So, just compare the sheer size of, what is now the fourth largest country in the world compared to Britain, which was, absolutely packed. And again, this I think is a good time to talk about the enclosure issues. And you mentioned
real quick, what year were you looking for? 1840?
1850.
1850. Because I don't think it's quite as much as you were thinking. It looks like 23 million in 1850.
23 million. Okay.
Yeah.
Again, very small. Nearly half the population of the United Kingdom at that point. But I think this probably is a good time to talk about the enclosures because
By the way, totally separate from this topic, people keep bringing up enclosures. I've got a guy on Twitter who his entire critique of capitalism has to do with enclosures, and the idea being that I think it's not just in England. We see it in, for example, Latin America, that similar moves are made of seizing land and handing it to basically the politically connected, right? So that this is a pattern we see again and again. I think and this is why if you do enough international study of international history, you'll start running into land reform keeps coming up. Somebody's pushing for land reform, but the elite don't want it, and so he gets assassinated or something, or someone does get land reform through, and then what happens after that? So land reform is like a constant theme. Going back to this period, I guess, right?
Yes, and just to give you like a brief overview, I mean, England is unique in that it had basically done away with feudalism rather quickly. In France and in Germany and in Russia much later, feudalism sort of operated, until the 18th century. But in England, most of that was done away during the latter half of the 14th century, thanks to the Black Death. I mean, one of the unexpected benefits of the Black Death was that I think England's population was around 4 million before the Black Death, and afterwards it was about 2 to 2.5 million. Of course, absolutely sort of horrific demise of the population. But the result of this was that land workers could actively compete, as in they were much sought after. And as a result, the strip system, which many peasants at the time had an allocated amount of land for subsistence, and they gave a little bit of surplus to their lord. This is called the manor system. This broke apart because there was simply too much land and not enough peasants. So as a result, peasants, were roaming far more, and they got more and more land. However, this began to change in the 16th and the 17th centuries, when you have the beginning of the enclosure movements. Now, again, just to put in perspective, enclosure basically is putting up, a little fence around the land and saying peasants can't freely roam and, have subsistence farming on this land. And it was considered an ancient privilege of the English, where the peasants could have a area of, a certain manor, only to a certain lord, and they could farm that freely without interference. Well, you could say this was the defense of early private property rights, and it caused quite a few rebellions, which again Marxists put down to the social conditions, such as the Kett's Rebellion during the reign of Edward VI in, I think it's 1549, and Marxist historians tend to look at this period as the greatest source of social agitation came from the enclosure system. And as you mentioned, the argument is that it came from a lot of sort of political wheeling and dealing in terms of landlords, seizing the land for themselves and impoverishing the peasants. But in many cases, it was the peasants themselves who were reforming and creating these enclosures simply to make the land more effective, because the at pre-enclosure system barely produced enough food. The strip system, only allowed sort of workers to rise to the level of subsistence. And so when you have these larger consolidated farms with definite boundaries, they will run much more efficiently, and their actual sort of the value of the land increased. And this was used as the pretext. And again, I think that assessment, again, I'm not an economic historian, but that's my understanding of it, is brilliantly contrasted to the Marxist assessment here. And quoted in this book, we have Engels on the condition of the working class in England. I think, again, this illustrates a lot of the problems when we get to the Marxist analysis, which is here. The workers vegetated throughout a passably comfortable existence, leading a righteous and peaceful life in all piety and probity, and the material condition was far better than that of their successors. They did not need to overwork. They did no more than they chose to do, and yet earned what they needed. They had leisure for healthful work in the garden or field, work which in itself was recreation for them, and they could take part beside in the recreation and games of their neighbours, and all these games, bowling, cricket, football, etc., contributed to their physical health and vigour. They were, for the most part, strong, well-built people in whose physique little or no difference from their peasant neighbours was discoverable. Their children grew up in fresh country air, and if they could help their parents at work, it was only occasionally, while of 8 or 12 hours work for them was no question.
Which is just a fantasy for anyone who's worked on a farm.
Absolutely, yeah.
Farm work actually is quite hard and risky, right?
Yeah.
That's the other aspect of it that they don't tend to focus on when they're being romantic about it.
Absolutely, and of course, a feature before we have like the advances in medicine in particular throughout the 19th century is that we continually have plagues. And I'm just talking about the cities themselves. I mean, London would have plagues which would regularly wipe out about a third of the city's population all the way up until the second half of the 17th century. And so again, this I find it very contentious, this idyll of the conditions of the working classes. I mean, of course, during the 18th century, smallpox was a huge killer, one of the greatest killers in the world at that time. And it's during that century we also have the rise of inoculation. So there were many technological innovations. I will, however, say, in fairness to this view, there is one bit of slack I'll cut. Is are you aware of course you are, AA's John Smith assessment?
Oh yeah, the blacksmith, the life of the blacksmith, right?
Yes. Well, he placed that worker around, I think it's the 1380s, and he compared it to a worker of the 1810s, 1820s, I think it's fair to say that there would have been very little noticeable improvement from that period throughout 1380 until 1820. And like I said, it's really after 1820 that we have this this rapid growth. You can almost say it was worse in the 17th century because of the overpopulation. And this is where we get obviously Malthusian economics, which is, in my view, completely discredited by the Industrial Revolution.
Right. So in addition to plagues, I also wanted to bring up famines. I actually, Austrian economics was my second shot at getting interested in economics. AM. The first time was that I was required as part of my engineering degree to take 1 semester of microeconomics and 1 semester of macro. Now, this was mainstream economics. So not only is it not very good economics, but it's just dull as dishwater, you know. So it didn't grab me. Having said that, and I wish I should keep this passage somewhere where I can turn to it quickly. There was a passage that really, a couple passages that really struck me. They were talking about what a change economic growth had brought about. Or you could say the Industrial Revolution and the ongoing Industrial Revolution. And they made a couple points on it, but the one that I'm remembering right now is that they simply listed the general famines in England and in France. They might have included Germany. And they just listed the years. And they went all the way up into the 1700s, as I recall. And what is a general famine? That means that, you know, there's bad weather or something like that, and the crops don't do well. Typically, that's the cause. And people are so close to the edge of surviving that causes people to die of starvation in large numbers. And these general famines, it was a stunner to read this. I'm sorry I don't have it at hand, but it was just happening a lot, like many times per century, until a little bit closer to about this period. You start to see it tail off, and not in the United States. I don't know that I don't think the United States ever had a general famine, which is part of the reason why people came here, I guess. But in the old world, these general famines were a fact of life, much like the plagues in the urban areas that AM was talking about. So that needs to be taken into account when you judge the Industrial Revolution and the conditions of people. That you've got people who were dying out there in the countryside, starving to death in the countryside on a regular basis, semi-regular basis, and now suddenly you see them and they're all there in front of you in the city, and they are just barely making it. Certainly at first. Now eventually, we start to see real improvements, noticeable improvements, which we, I even quoted a little bit from the book. But at first, you've got people who are right on the edge of starvation, and they're just shifting where they are from being out scattered in the countryside to concentrated in the cities. And then you have another wave of it seems like. So this is the English I'm thinking of, the English workers coming into the cities. Then you have the wave of the Irish coming over from the famine in Ireland. Again, on the edge of, some of them literally dying, right? And some of them making it over and just barely surviving or whatever. So yeah, this is, you can imagine that the picture wasn't always pretty. But you've got to have the wider context, because the story that gets told, and you hear it from Ingalls there, is that things were just ducky until suddenly they were, brutally pushed into the factory and long hours. And that doesn't seem like a correct perspective.
Absolutely. And I think bringing in a moral argument here against socialism, communism, etc., Marxism, Leninism, I think it's important to note that whilst, Engels and co are critiquing the system, when we see mass famines in the 20th century, it is not brought on by, the effects that we're basically describing now, the effects of the pre-industrial civilization, but is brought on by man-made famines, often implemented by socialist regimes, such as the war in the Soviet Union or the Great Leap Forward in Maoist China.
Yep. Cambodia.
Absolutely, yeah.
In fact, AM, I actually sat there and I don't know if I actually wrote out the years and everything, but I did a little think on it and dug around a little. And I believe that all the countries that really went like hard communist as opposed to sort of social democrat or something, all the ones that really did like the Leninist revolutionary Marxism had famines. I'm not sure that there's maybe Cuba is an exception, but it might be just that I don't know about their famine. But in general, think of a Leninist regime, Marxist-Leninist regime, and I can probably look it up and give you the year that they had at least 1 year that they had a famine, potentially more than one. North Korea, on and on and on. It goes through all of them, and the Soviet Union itself.
Yes,
this is a terrible famine right at the beginning.
I mean, this is one, again, beautiful comparison. We point to Sir Robert Peel, whose instinct upon the famine. You can say what you want about Sir Robert Peel, whether he betrayed, the conservative movement. I believe he did, but nevertheless, that's an aside for this point. At the time that Ireland was suffering, he made it easier to import cheap wheat into the country to ameliorate that condition, whilst in the Soviet Union, the concern was rather selling grain abroad, because of course Russia was a breadbasket, to help in the early industrialization under the 5-year plans, rather than feed their own populations.
Right, to turn exported wheat into hard currency, where they could buy things they needed to try to kickstart their own industrial revolution.
Exactly.
Right. So this is the most people know about the Holodomor. They tried to come up with a name that attached to the Holocaust, right? Fairly, I think. But this is the Ukraine is what people usually think of. But actually, I see Jonathan Poles in the chat, so I can't help but mention that it wasn't just the Ukraine. It was also the so-called Black Earth regions, which were the Ukraine and some other areas of the former Russian Empire.
Yes.
Many of which featured not just Ukrainians, but also Germans that had immigrated. The Tsars had brought Germans over to be farmers.
Yes, this is the Volga region. So we're talking east of Kursk, and this region between like the Don and the Volga River valleys, which traditionally have been one of the bread baskets of Europe, and again turned into this wasteland. And as Jonathan Poland is saying in the chat, USSR famine 1921 to 1922, 1933 to 1933, 1946 to 1947 is just horrific. Right, and so the horrific image from that I retain from the 19 which year am I thinking of? Yeah, the 32 to 33 era famine is that in these Black Earth regions, they're shooting someone for hiding some straw, some wheat from the field to try to feed their family, while they're exporting all of this to turn it into hard currency so they can buy what the regime wants to buy. Exactly. So it's just a horrendous time there. Anyway, okay, so having touched on some of the facts on the ground, the children, the living conditions, I want to turn back to the historiography, which is where maybe we both feel a little more firm-footed. The chapter by Bertrand de Jouvenel, not surprisingly, I've read him before, he's very sharp, is called The Treatment of Capitalism by Continental Intellectuals. But boy, does he land some interesting blows. I already shared one with you about, how do you explain people choosing to the proletariat choosing to go to the factories in the United States where there was plenty of land, which I thought was a brilliant point I'd never heard before. Let's see. I'm just trying to find some of the things I wanted to make sure to share from de Jouvenel here. Oh, yeah. Well, okay. This just because I thought it was funny. I shared it in part on Twitter. I thought it was great. To the intellectual, the social device of capitalism. Oh, by the way, so he talks about he noticed the chapter of his title, Treatment of Capitalism by Intellectuals. So he speaks a little more broadly than just historians, which is fair, as AM pointed out, because you've also got like novelists and,
there's a whole class of people who are starting to paint this
Yes,
picture.
I mean, I think this is also just an aside. I mean, historian. I mean, there's this assumption here with Whig historians. Well, the actual professionalization of history really takes place during this period as well. But you also have the emergence of various other academic disciplines that coincide with this, all of which are concerned invariably with economic history. So, for example, we mentioned Max Weber. Max Weber, I wouldn't count as a historian so much as a sociologist.
Right. Yeah. Right. So de Jouvenel thinks you need to think about sort of this as a class, and I'll talk a little bit more about. He gives some context for thinking about that class that I think is really valuable and relevant to what we're dealing with right now. But anyway, listen to this. To the intellectual, the social device of capitalism offers a displeasing picture. Why? In his own terms, here are self-seeking men in quest of personal can I get that word right? Aggrandizement. How? By providing consumers with things they want or can be induced to want. The same intellectual, puzzlingly, is not shocked by the workings of hedonist democracy. Here also, self-seeking men, politicians, accomplish their aggrandizement by promising to other men things they want or are induced to demand. The difference seems to lie mainly in that the capitalist delivers the goods. I thought that was a great little line. He also gives a sort of origin, and I hope I can find it, but he basically talks about the changing nature of the intellectual over time. Brilliant.
I'm slightly skeptical of this, but nevertheless, it's still quite interesting to consider.
It's provocative, isn't it? And I'm not sure, I'm having trouble finding it exactly, but he basically talks about stages where originally you have the there we go. He talks about the originally in the medieval era, anything that we could call something like an intelligentsia is working for the church. Okay, and so they are actually doing something. Yeah, here he says the medieval church centered its attention and its work on the unfortunate. It was the protector of the poor, and it performed all the functions which have now devolved on the welfare state. Knowing the history of what happened in the U.S., I would say it was forcibly taken from the churches and fraternal associations and taken by the state. But anyway.
And indeed, in England, of course, we had the Reformation, we had the dissolution of the monasteries, so probably even more dramatically happening over here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't a natural organic process. But anyway, so the functions which we now think of as welfare functions, right? Feeding the destitute, healing the sick, educating the people. All these services were free, provided out of the wealth shunted to them by church taxes and huge gifts vigorously pressed for by the clergy, right? While the church was forever thrusting the condition of the poor before the eyes of the rich, it was forever scolding the latter. So he says, here's sort of stage one, right, is that you've got people working for the church, and in line with their Christian mission, they are providing help for the poor and getting funded by the rich, right? Yeah. And they're not doing this as a profit-making enterprise, right? They're non-profits, so to speak. So that's sort of stage one. Then he goes to stage two, and he says, you start to get the secular intellectuals arising. And he says, interestingly, the secular intellectuals originally are in alliance with the merchants. He says, basically just because they're both sort of rising at a similar time. Neither of them are the nobility.
Yes, just to add a little bit of context, if that's all right, because I think it's a good passage, but I think it's very light on actual historical details and comparisons. Yeah. I think this actually falls into one of Hayek's issues, that the abstractions from history are in some ways more powerful than that of the political theorists, because it's actionable in this case. But to give an obvious comparison is the rise of the third estate in France. So on the one hand, we have the merchant classes, the urban dwelling, and again the financial classes. Yet on the other hand, we also have the rise of the lawyer. and the legal professions. And it's the people from these legal professions who will occupy the positions in the National Convention government after, the monarchy is toppled. So yes, I think that's an obvious example of where these factors go hand in hand. I can't remember with this chapter, but he was also mentioning a fact which was quite interesting, how the veneration of the tax farmer was one of the other little interesting additions.
Oh, that was amazing. Oh, I would love to find that. You're right, because he said think about the tax farmer, think about what they do, and it's you find some interesting parallels. Okay, I'm just gonna have to try to do it from memory. I underlined all this stuff, but here we go. I found it. The tax farmer combined all the features commonly attributed to the bad capitalist without any of the latter's redeeming features. He produced nothing. He profited in proportion to the harshness of his agents, and he retained his privilege by corruption. What a paradox it is that this type of moneymaker should have been popular with the intellectual of his day, and that unpopularity should have become the lot of the moneymaker at the time when his chief form of moneymaking became the manufacture of goods for popular use. So he's arguing that the alliance of the early intellectuals, the rising intellectuals, the lawyers, was most strongly with the tax farmer. A tax farmer, if you don't know, if you know your Bible, this would be a publican, I think, or it just says tax collector. But the idea is that the state says, I need to collect this many taxes from this region or this town or whatever. The tax farmer says, I'll just give you that money right now, and I'll take the risk of, collecting it. And the state's like, this sounds like a great deal to me. I get the money now, you deal with the grief, the heartache, the busy work of going around collecting money. But to make this an attractive proposition for why would the tax collector do this, the publican do this? They would be able to collect a bit more than was actually needed to give to the government. So, they'd have to hand over 500 units to the government, and they'd collect 700 and pocket the 200 as the difference, right? As you can imagine, and you might have picked up if you've read any New Testament, any Gospels, the tax collectors were not popular. Tax collectors aren't popular anyway, right? But this was like insult upon injury, right? Not only are you going to take what, in the context of the New Testament, not only are you going to take what the Romans want, but you're going to stick it to us even more. And then notably, they would live large, they weren't investing that money generally. They were just living, they were just being very showy with their wealth. So this did not make them popular. And so that's why they were very humble when they came to Jesus, it seems. they knew they were not viewed as heroes by anyone. So anyway, he that was quite interesting that he says that there seemed to be a particular connection there. But then he says eventually the intellectual class becomes anti-capitalist, right? So that's sort of the third stage. The second stage, they're mostly lawyers. They're to some degree allied with the rising merchant class, but in particular the tax collectors. And the third stage is the stage we're still in, I guess, right? Which is that we associate the intellectual with not being particularly sympathetic to entrepreneurs, shall we say. Now it takes the form of Marxism, but I think de Jouvenel's point is that this progression was happening before we had Karl Marx. You already had the intellectual class starting to turn on this. And so you see someone like a Charles Dickens who, maybe you'd know better than me, I am. I've never heard anyone say anything about Charles Dickens being like a socialist or a Marxist.
No, Charles Dickens is an interesting character. I mean, to my mind, his biggest inspiration was actually Thomas Carlyle. It wasn't socialist writing. So say, for example,
Carlyle we would consider a right-winger or something like that, right?
Yes, exactly. And this, to me, speaks more of the fact that, again, this is both a conservative reaction and it is a leftist reaction, although for, different purposes. For example, A Tale of Two Cities, I believe, is basically just inspired by Carlyle's A History of the French Revolution. So, yes, there's a strong collection there, and they cover many of the same concerns as well.
Right. Okay. So I think I've roughly, I should have done more quoting from de Jouvenel, but I think I kind of gave a rough summary of his sort of three-stage story. What do you question about it?
Well, I think that there's a wonderful little irony about it. I mean, on one hand, we're critiquing the dialectical approach of the Marxist, and de Jouvenel is in many ways actually inverting it and imposing this dialectic on the Marxist theoreticians themselves. And that's what I find quite funny about it. I'm always skeptical of a very broad strokes analysis like that. That would be my one criticism. But I found that little inversion of the dialectic rather amusing.
Right. But I mean, the fun part about de Jouvenel throwing that out there, right, is it gives us a new thing to keep our eye on as we're studying history.
And one of the crucial things, is again the association with the intellectuals and power in particular. I mean, de Jouvenel's obviously other pioneering work is on power, but again, it's this idea that I'm not sure again whether I agree with it, and I think de Jouvenel is much softer on the church, probably rightly so, arguing that the intellectual, whether he be, the friar or the monk, there is an ascetic quality that's admirable. But when it comes to the secular theoretician, it's very much as part of an advocacy group to take away the traditional power of the church and acquire it for the state, the forces of which he's basically allied with. So in terms of, again, he allies with the capitalists when the capitalists are, reaching their ascendancy, then finally allies with the state against the capitalists, which is the final stage. And yes, I find that analysis quite interesting, but I think he makes that emphasis at the end. This is worthy of a study rather than a study in itself, and I'll take it as that.
Right. He's throwing it out there. Let me throw out a little more from de Jouvenel, because I found this chapter absolutely fascinating. A little bit more on a development that might surprise you of the intelligentsia. He says the lay intelligentsia, growing away from its clerical root, seemed to turn its back on the preoccupations of the church. Evidence of its interest in what came in the 19th century to be called the social question is up to that time remarkably scant. There is, however, abundant evidence of a sustained fight by the lay intellectuals against the welfare institutions of their day, administered by the church. During the Middle Ages, the church had amassed immense wealth from pious gifts and foundations for charitable purposes. From the Renaissance to the 18th century, these accumulations were returned to private possession through far-reaching confiscation. One that comes to mind, I think, is the Knights Templar. They were. Oh
yes, he's talking about Charles IV, isn't he? Yes, that's the revisionist tale that it wasn't anything about the supposedly paganistic rituals of the Knights Templar, but yes, it was a Henry VIII-esque move by Charles IV, because not only was he trying to dispossess and take all the property of the Knights Templar, which was one of the most powerful organizations in Europe. I believe it had its own banking system within it as well.
Right.
But it was also basically containing the Pope in Avignon at the same time. So it's a lot of massive power moves being made by Philip IV.
Right. So these confiscations, right, from the church. In this process, the intellectuals played a major role. Servants of the temporal power, they started from the simple fact that the wealth of the church was least amenable to tax. So the state is always hungry for funds.
Yes, I mean, in terms of like a direct example, he's bringing in the lawyers, the secular lawyers in service of the king, and he doesn't say it, but the obvious allusion is obviously to Thomas Cromwell, the official who's responsible primarily, more so than any other official, for the dissolution of the monasteries in England, and the taking away of that organic independent institution of the monastery, which was like an economy unto itself. It didn't service the state in any way, and it sent its tithes to Rome. So instead, the monarch, in terms of, in this case, Henry VIII, massive expansion of his temporal and fiscal authority, dispossesses that wealth, prevents the tithes, prevent the appeals to Rome, and accumulates all those resources and the functions of the monasteries to the state. And this is a feature all across Europe with the Protestant Reformation. But in terms of the history of this, obviously it's an English history of the Industrial Revolution, it's obviously most pertinent to bring in the case of the English Reformation.
Right. So continuing his story, because it continues to be interesting, I think. This is a bit of a rabbit hole, but as I mentioned earlier, I have an interest in this transition of the welfare function into the hands of the state, right? So I'm always interested in pieces of that story. So they moved. So the issue that they couldn't tax the church funds as easily, right? They'd like to move that money somewhere where it can be taxed. They moved by degrees to the idea that property was more productive in private hands, and hence that private enterprise was the best servant of the prince's treasure. I guess private in this sense, the church would not be private hands. Finally, it became a truism that the prince lost his due and the subject his chance by the piling up of wealth in undying hands, foundations, right?
Yes.
The lay intellectuals took little account of the social needs fulfilled by the institutions which they sought to destroy. Beggars should be rounded up and led to forced labor. This was the great remedy in sharp contrast to the medieval attitude. It is not an undue comparison to liken the attitude of the secular intelligentsia to that of the most rabid opponents of the social services in our day, except they went so much further. So that is very interesting to me.
Yes, and
the story I know about in the U.S. is really the progressive era. So really about 100 years ago, where the fraternal societies and the role of various churches start to get replaced by the experts.
Yes,
we need the experts to take care of this, not this sloppy laissez-faire welfare provision. We need, basically like social workers. I don't know that they used that term back then. That might be anachronistic, but you get the idea. We need to bring in the expertise of the social worker and get rid of these spontaneous organizations like fraternal societies and churches helping people and stuff, and that'll make everything better. Which brings us to the current with the welfare state, which we've discussed on a previous show about the history of Black Americans since the Civil War, right? Anyway, but go ahead, sir.
Oh no, you've basically covered the point anyway. So
okay.
Leaving me to speak.
Right. Okay. Anyway, I underlined so much. There's so much good stuff in this book. Actually, there's some stuff I didn't like as much. The American chapter, just I don't know. Got very
by Alan Packer. Yes, his argument, just in brief summary, was that it wasn't so much influenced by Marxism, the American school, especially prior to the 1920s, but his thinking, the thinking of Americans, such as that of Charles A. Beard in The Rise of American Civilization and Economic Interpretation of the American Constitution, it was much more of a extended battle between Jeffersonianism and Hamiltonism. So obviously the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans, moving into, advocates for agrarianism. So maybe that's one sort of reactionary element. I mean, on my own channel, I've discussed how Jefferson was, always in favor of this, you could say, this Roman ideal of the ideal sort of militiaman, working, sword into plowshed, kind of like the example of George Washington. And this, republic was going to be very closely styled on the Roman Republic in that sense, and how it does sort of represent this continuation of that romantic ideal, and how this, was pitted against the again, the desires of, in this case, Hamilton, to centralize and make the US economy more stable, especially when confronted with foreign competition, and how that extended through the era of Jackson and into the area of FDR.
And it's that chapter is tricky for me because we Rothbardian libertarians tend to be more Jeffersonian and not be very happy with Hamilton.
Oh yes, I noticed that. I also found it rather interesting. He was trying to lump Jeffersonianism and Roosevelt's New Deal in as part of the same group, and I found that, because again I lean more to the Jeffersonian, decentralized grouping as well. I think you and I had that conversation on Twitter, lamenting the Kleinstaaterei of the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
So yes, I found that a bit of a stretch, talking about the association with Jefferson and FDR. I think what was more interesting is the party affiliation of the American Communist Party breeding this new idea of an intellectual, because of course it happens in England at the same time, with the you can say one of the dominant groups of historians throughout most of the 20th century were of course the Marxist historians. So I'm talking Eric Hobsbawm and E.H. Carr and others such as E.P. Thompson, who would veer off and actually sort of no longer become communists after 1956 and the crushing of the revolution in Hungary. Nevertheless, Eric Hobsbawm in particular, probably E.H. Carr less so, had a colossal effect on the narrative of England. I mean, you can basically say that his trilogy, the Age of Revolution, the Age of Capitalism, I think the Age of Empire is the third one, if I can remember correctly, has had a marked effect, and all this owing not just to the actual residual effects of the Marxist interpretation, but this is direct Communist Party membership. These are card-carrying members of the Communist Party who also happen to be historians at the same time. Right, so yes, that's an important consideration to make. That these aren't just social activists, as Ashton was making about Arnold Toynbee. In some cases they are Fabian socialists, or they are actual Marxist-Leninists.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And there's the effect. I mean, I guess most people know this, but just in case you don't know, the effect of people like this, essentially, somewhere on the narrow range between fellow travelers and outright like spies for the Soviet Union or something, right? Sort of those range of people just had such a tremendous influence. I think particularly in the post-World War II era, in a number of academic areas. Well, that's what we're suffering from in the universities right now. I
would say even in the post-World War I era, because of course one of the most famous English philosophers is of course Bertrand Russell, and Bertrand Russell was a very early Soviet apologist. And again, talking about there is another quote here in the book regarding Bertrand Russell. And again, it's just repeating the myth. The Industrial Revolution caused unspeakable misery both in England and in America. I do not think any student of economic history can doubt that the average happiness in England in the early 19th century can compare with the average happiness in the early 19th century was lower than that had been 100 years earlier. And this was entirely due to scientific technique. So again, it's just this constant association with technological progress somehow being detrimental due to this Marxist dialectic of dehumanization. Right. I think just to elaborate what the Marxists are talking about, the Marxists associate a lot with the dignity of labor. So, one of the transition from skilled labor, like artisanal labor, into unskilled labor, where, we have the division of labor, where a worker becomes a cog. The Marxists are very concerned with this as part of the overall sort of process of dehumanization and, essentially becoming wage slaves. And that's a core component. And this sort of brings into the utopian idea where a worker should be free to, do whatever he wants and follow Marx's own principles of being able to work sort of 3 hours a day on whatever you want and etc. Again, we haven't true Marxism, true socialism has never been tried, so we've yet to see how this would manifest. But
right. So there is one more piece that I'll pull out, and then let's respond to chats, unless you have other thoughts you wanted to make sure to get in. This is from Hayek's introduction, and I'm glad I stumbled on it because it reminds me that this is a key thing that you have to understand. I brought up the general famines, and I kind of mentioned in passing that eventually they stopped. So Hayek writes, he writes, it was only when the larger gains from the employment of machinery provided both the means and the opportunity for their investment that what in the past had been a recurring surplus of population doomed to early death was in an increasing measure given the possibility of survival. Numbers which had been practically stationary for many centuries began to increase rapidly. The proletariat, which capitalism can be said to have created, was thus not a proportion of the population which would have existed without it and which it had degraded to a lower level. It was an additional population which was enabled to grow up by the new opportunities for employment which capitalism provided. So what is he saying, going back to the Malthus reference you made, Am? What he's saying is that Malthus was kind of right for a while, that with the means of production that were available, there were general famines and the population would just was flat. it hit a certain level and just wouldn't go beyond it. Instead, people would just starve to death. There'd be occasional general famines, and it'd just keep that population level at a certain place. It's only with the Industrial Revolution that we see the population growth punch through that ceiling that had been on it. And so Hayek's point is, the image we've been given is there's the happy people out in the working in the sunshine and all that, and then they're forced into the factories and where they are in these horrible conditions. And Hayek says a better way to think about it is they were dying out in those fields, starving to death, and then through the productivity brought about by the Industrial Revolution, people lived instead of dying. And so the mortality rate went down, infant mortality rate eventually went down, so on and so forth. And you started to see the growing populations such that England, though not Ireland, that's a whole story that we want to talk about someday, maybe. I don't know. But anyway, England's population started growing in the 19th century rather dramatically, right?
Yeah.
And Hayek would say that, broadly speaking, it's because the capitalism or the free market, the effects of the market brought about survival, where in the past there would just have been general famines wiping out portions of the population.
Absolutely. Probably one more note. There's also one final point I'd like to make after that, but just a continuation note. We'll talk about England, of course. There was also a marked improvement in Germany at the same time. I mean, just for context, yes. Germany, after the Napoleonic Wars, had a smaller population than France. By the beginning of the First World War, the German population, I think, was around 60 million, and the population of France was around 40 million. And this, again, was the effect of industrialization. So not only did this have, a marked effect on England, but also Germany as well, which had, always traditionally had a smaller population than France. And again, the effects of France's limited industrial potential had severe economic ramifications down the line. But again, that's a different discussion. But there is one point I want to talk about, which is, again, going back to the historiography, which is this pathologizing of what it means to be capitalism, and this emanating from the historiography. What has capitalism actually come to mean to these theorists? I mean, on the one hand, it's just a rational technique for inducing profits. That's essentially all it is. I mean, in Marxist analysis, it is the fact that a capitalist class owns the means of production and the workers do not own the means of production. Even if you take that Marxist analysis, it's quite a simple concept to understand. Yet to these historians, capitalism becomes an entire raison d'etre for the progress of history, a history in itself which becomes entirely dependent on economic factors and entirely materialistic. So eventually you have the deposition of all of these political histories and etc., all thrown out of the way, and everyone is made atoms, basically vessels of this economic determinism. And it goes further. There's a quote in the Ashton paragraph, which I think is quite interesting, talking about the spirit of capitalism, which of course will be pioneered by Max Weber's work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. From being a phrase suggesting a mental or emotional attitude, it has become an impersonal superhuman force. It is no longer men and women exercising free choice who affect change, but capitalism, or the spirit of capitalism, says Schumpeter, develops rationality. Capitalism exalts the monetary unit. Capitalism produces the mental attitude of modern science. Modern pacifism, modern international morality, modern feminism are products of capitalism. Whatever this is, it certainly is not economic history. It has introduced a new mysticism into the recounting of plain facts. And the reason I bring that up, this pathologizing of forces, which again are very ahistorical, in the sense that this isn't based on any sort of historical rationalism, rather this is dealing with concepts pertaining to critical theory, is that this is obviously within Marxist analysis become easily substituted for anything you want. So say, for example, capitalism, the idea of capitalism as being representing a political dogma or some sort of cultural hegemony becomes the raison d'etre that needs to be defeated in Gramscianism or cultural Marxism. And then when we go into social history, when we accept postmodernism, and where everything becomes a social construct. Everything just becomes this, mystical force which needs to be defeated. I can't help but think of the Smithsonian pamphlet that was produced last year, which attributed things like hard work to white supremacy or something along those lines. You just substitute the phantom into the system and you make it a force which you remove all sort of individual agency. And I think, to me, that's one of the most detrimental elements of this Marxist historical trend. And again, you could say it begins with this critique of capitalism, which results in a deterministic materialist version of history, which I think, tragic for all involved.
Right. And I know Paul Gottfried writes about how what we're dealing with now are not really Marxists. And he says, I'd much rather deal with a classical Marxist in some ways than the modern social justice warrior or whatever. Having said that, I agree with you. I mean, I don't know what term to use. I don't even know what Hegelian means. Maybe that's the better term to use. I don't know. But there is a pattern that we see being repeated, right? Where, maybe it's not the classical Marxists talking about socializing the means of production anymore. And capitalism, per se, is not the main enemy that they're talking about constantly, though they still seem to be anti-capitalist, I notice. But it seems like the same motion is being made each time.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, you can't help but notice the pattern.
Yes, exactly. And this is why I think, again, this is from this area, which is, again, built on a historical myth, which was the thing we brought up at the beginning, how the myths affect, not only, our understanding, but the universal understanding. I mean, one other point to mention is that academics, once you have established an academic consensus, it becomes very hard to break out of this. It forms a momentum of its own. And again, come back to Jouvenel's point of being associated with power. And then we have this, as you mentioned, shift from classical Marxism to the cultural Marxism. Again, it depressingly, I think, becomes an irresistible force. And this is, also elaborated through Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse with the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. And I just see it emanating from this this same mode of thought, which removes the agent out of the historical process, which
right.
Yeah.
Popper actually wrote something quite good on this, of all people, and I recommend it to you, AM, if you want any sort of meta stuff. It's called The Poverty of Historicism.
Yes, I've read that book.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I actually thought that was a pretty good one by him, because he's attacking exactly what you're talking about. The history becoming just sort of this interplay of forces, and also, of course, this other aspect, the thing that part of what makes Marxism supposedly scientific, this historical determinism.
Yes.
And it's from that historical determinism that we get the very notion of a progressive, right? Because how can you talk about being a progressive unless history has sort of like a direction?
Precisely.
Right? And a reactionary then is someone who wants to turn back the clock, who wants to not go in the direction that history is trying to go.
Exactly.
The reactionary is impeding that, right? Which is clearly, how could you impede the forward roll of history? That's
exactly. It's even worse than that. It's the implication that the motive, the intention is, purposeless. It's doomed to begin with, and that these people may as well be clinically insane.
Right. Yeah. You're fighting fate. It really, I mean, that's what it ends up being, right? Thinking in old pagan terms, yes. You're just fighting fate or fighting the gods.
Well, what I find ironic is that history as a discipline, it begins as theogonic. It begins as trying to elucidate a pattern of development from divine inspiration, and it ends up being developing a pattern from divine inspiration, which is
a secularized version of it. Or
yes,
something.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, let's. We only have a few comments, so we should be able to move towards wrapping this up. Ever faithful Mickey the Fourth says, finally moved on to the subscribe star. This was actually a week ago. I guess it must have been after the show. But I must complain that it does not provide as cool colors as YouTube super chats. Robert Emmett Walsh says, listen to amplitude modulation is always enlightening. Amplitude modulation. he must be talking about a channel, I'm guessing. Okay, and then on the YouTube side, we have Leo Borealis. Economy is downstream from culture. Culture is formed by known history. Do not overlook how geography is pivotal for the mental landscape and how this in turn shapes cultural and economic activity. I've actually influenced quite a bit. This just reminds me. I'm influenced quite a bit, I am, by Tolkien in these matters, of all people. He was a linguist, right? And the reason why he ended up with Lord of the Rings and all that stuff is because he was working on inventing a language, Elvish. And because he was a linguist, because he understood language deeply, he knew that it was intimately tied to history.
Mm.
And so, in essence, I mean, I'm not saying that this was like a conscious original decision. Eventually, he sort of realized what he was doing. But in essence, he realized that he couldn't come up with a language unless there was a history to go along with it.
Precisely, yes.
So from this point of view, right, this is why he would probably laugh at the idea that Esperanto will ever win the day, because it's a language divorced from history.
Mm.
Right? So it doesn't have, it's incomplete, you could say.
Yes, precisely.
Right? So I guess in some ways I'm kind of disagreeing. I'm sorry, I'm kind of agreeing with what he's saying. Language, history, culture, all of these things are intertwined in a really intimate way, right? And he says this in turn shapes the cultural and economic activity. Right. So what's been really interesting, and I continue to watch with interest as we do our Mad Merc and I do episodes on China and so forth. You're taking this economic mode of, something like laissez-faire capitalism, and you're trying to do it in Japan and China and various places that, having visited China, I can tell you haven't gone through the cultural transformation that Christianity brought to Europe, shall we say.
Yeah.
It was quite startling to be in China and hear the way they talk about superstition in a very casual way, and to realize that this is a culture that didn't go through that transformation that Europe went through.
Well, interestingly, they did almost go through that transformation, albeit in a very distorted way with the Taiping rebellion. But that's definitely a discussion for another time.
Right. So anyway, in some ways it seems like, well, clearly, we're taking the lessons learned from Christendom, that developed into these modes of doing the economy, transporting them to lands that don't have that whole history of religion and culture and so forth. The political history of decentralization, for example, that we have in Europe,
yes.
Which I don't think you really see in China, for example. I don't think they have that history of truly independent, of overlapping, somewhat independent polities. That mosaic that you see in medieval Europe, you don't quite see that in a place like China, right? How's it going to go? Like, how long? I mean, there's no question they're benefiting from adopting some of the lessons from European capitalism, you could call it. But how long will it last, right? How long will the culture just won't fit it? And so it'll become just outright state capitalism, which it kind of is in China right now, for example. Anyway, thoughts, Sam?
The thoughts on Chinese state capitalism. Yes, I think, again, from my understanding of Chinese history, I mean, Chinese history has always been a case of, direct centralized control, consistently, probably dramatically more so than any other country, whether it be Qin Huangdi building, the first Great Wall, or whether it be the Sui dynasty building the Grand Canal between the Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers, or whether it be the Ming dynasty, rebuilding the Great Wall, all of these, grand construction projects, which, invariably sort of, cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives, and these constant sort of, again, infrastructure programs. This, as you mentioned, this history of centralization. When China is decentralized, it's often to China's sort of historical shame. So I would be talking about again, Chinese historiography is interesting. On the one hand, the Yuan dynasty are historical conquerors, they're the Mongols. Yet on the other hand, they united China, because before then China had been the Jing and the Song dynasties. Why is Mao such a beloved figure? It's not because of his economic policies. Most people in China, have a sort of pragmatic view and basically think he was, misguided. It's because he unified China, because during World War II, the period of the warlords, China had been, divided, been, carved up into spheres of influence by the various great powers. It had been, physically invaded through Japan. So, yes, this emphasis on unity and state control, I would argue with you, yes, is a consistent trend throughout Japanese history. And I'm not sure how this experiment in capitalism is going to go.
They're trying to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? That's what we've discussed in our China episodes. They're trying to retain that political centralism while somehow allowing for economic entrepreneurship and balance that, right?
Yeah.
And so far, they seem to be pulling it off. We have question marks from our analysis. We think that there's a bit of a bubble in China, and that there's going to be a correction, and then we'll have to see what it looks like when the dust clears, But so far as the world can see, they seem to be pulling it off, and everybody thinks that, China is going to become super dominant because they've found a sort of a formula, right?
Yeah.
They can continue to have the CCP and have capitalism simultaneously, right? We'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. Yeah. Okay, next super chat. Ratface says, read Nietzsche's The Use and Abuse of History. I did not even know about that. That sounds kind of interesting, actually. Wonder if there's any chance it's short. I have difficulty reading long things at this point in my life just because of busyness. Yeah. Leo Borealis says, Radlib, remember the horrors made by Gaius Gracchus. Okay, this is where I wish the Britisher was here, but I think he was talking about land reforms. That's why he brought up Gaius Gracchus. Can you comment on that briefly?
Yes, the Gracchi brothers were a response to the large slave plantations, which were the result of the Third Punic Wars and the sack of Corinth, which resulted in these hundreds of thousands of North African and Greek slaves being imported into the empire. And I mentioned it with Jefferson, replacing this idyllic idea of the citizen farmer, with his plot of land and this agrarian form of lifestyle, with patricians owning very large tracts of land with slaves, which again completely outcompeted the Roman citizenry. And so in response, you can see that the Gracchi brothers were like a populist reaction against this, siding with the plebs against the patricians, promising land reform. And as a result, the patricians cooked up a conspiracy that Tiberius Gracchus was wanting to become king of Rome, and he was murdered.
So they put it down, right?
Carthage, not Corinth.
I said Carthage and Corinth, yeah. Carthage in the Punic Wars and Corinth in the Achaean War, the final Achaean War. I think Carthage.
Something. This is a strange lacuna in my knowledge. I have no idea how the Rome got dominant over Greece. I know it was, and I know at a certain point it wasn't, but I don't know what happened.
Probably another stream.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll see.
Well, I hate to show my own channel, but I've actually done that stream.
Oh, you have? What's it called?
It's called the Roman Conquest of the Greek World.
Oh, yeah, and it's so fascinating, right? Yeah, sorry, I'll cut off this rabbit hole in just a sec. It's so fascinating because it's certainly a political dominance, but it doesn't seem to exactly be a cultural dominance. In fact, it seems from that point of view to be sort of a reverse acquisition, we would call it these days. Right, AM?
Yes, it was definitely a fusion of Romano-Greek culture. I mean, the Romans didn't develop a intellectual tradition, independent of Greek until the 2nd century BC. So so much of what they had was, owed to the Greeks. So it was in many respects like a physical conquest by Rome, a political conquest by Rome, a legal conquest by Rome, but a cultural conquest by Greece, which, in turn, I think I can't remember who quoted this, but there's a wonderful quote. I think it's by Horace. I can't quite remember, but Greece civilized its brutish conqueror, or something along those lines. And
right. Yeah, I mean, and this was to some degree quite concrete. It was what was I going to say? They would get Greek tutors for their children, right?
Yes, who were invariably slaves. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Actually, interesting, read that you might find in the Senate at the time when the Roman Empire was expanding towards the east, there was much debate as to whether this was a right thing to do and whether they were going to be overstretched and whether this was actually a good thing going forward, because it would kind of open Pandora's box of conquest. But that's another stream.
Oh, so there was they saw empire coming, republic to empire coming. They saw that transition coming at them, and there were people who had questions about going that direction.
Yes,
right?
it's fascinating. Yeah. I mean, if you again, you can watch the stream if you want, but the broad summary is that they didn't begin physically annexing parts of Greece until after sort of 70 years of on and off conflict with them. It was very much Rome reimposing some form of stability and then departing. Declaring that we've proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks and we are your protectors, and then we'll go away, and then some intervention will cause. And it's only in the 150s and the 140s where Rome actually begins establishing a definitive physical presence. After like 100 years more so of on-off conflict with them.
Okay, well, this works out really well because it's a personal theory I have, and I'm a new YouTuber like you, I am. I'm just learning the ropes here. I have a personal theory, which is when I'm on another channel, I don't really want to just drop my channel link in. I want to pick a specific show we did that I think is of interest to the audience and share that with them. Because I feel like I'm just thinking about, for me personally, a general channel is a little too broad. Give me an entry point, an entryway. Give me some place to start, right? So I'm dropping into the chat the link to Roman Conquest of the Greek World, which was just from earlier this month, just a couple weeks ago. So it's very representative of what AM is up to on his channel. And it somehow came up in the course of our conversation. So I thought that'd be a nice way to get them rolling on your channel. Sound okay?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah. So I'm going to keep trying this theory until some smarter YouTuber than me shoots me down that it helps to point people to something more concrete than sort of a broad, here's a whole channel, sort of sell them on one thing that they listen to and hopefully get hooked, right? They listen to that and they go, oh, I really like what they're doing. What else has he done, right? Okay, so there's that. And then let's see. I would like to, again, if you like what you're hearing on this channel, economics, but with a, that wasn't it. Let's try that again. Sorry,
Might
ignore
want to
that.
remove that link.
Yeah, it's just anyway. Oh, all I can do is block myself. That's not what I want. Okay, yeah, I'll get rid of that. Yeah, so where is my... Oh, there we go. Yeah. So again, I would mention Subscribestar. It's a humble way to contribute. It's $5 a month, but I'm dropping that in the chat. But the advantage for us is that's you can tip through it. It's sort of super chat. It's called tips. But the advantage for us is that we start to build a base of support of predictable income and can make plans, right? Like the massive green screen I showed you over in the corner, which I got the big one so that not only would I be able to replace the painting, as lovely as it is. In fact, everybody say goodbye to the painting. I know you're used to it for a year and a half now, or almost more than a year and a half, but I probably won't be seeing it again once I put the green screen up. But not only will it support doing the show, but I got it big so that I could do like Mrs. Radlib streams that we've been doing, which I think people have been enjoying, and we have more coming on that front. Yeah, people are saying no. Mickey's saying no in the chat to losing the painting. Anything else we want to bring up before we sign off, Mad Merc, for the folks?
No.
Okay, then thanks to Apostolic Majesty for joining us at a lengthy time, and I think possibly a little bit late where he is. So thank you so much. It seems like being a YouTuber involves things like being able to not go to the bathroom for long periods of time and stay up late at night. These seem to be two of the things that help you
yes,
in your career.
It sums up our glamorous life, our glamorous existence.
Okay, thanks everybody. Well, next week should be Econ minis and talk about some current events. But
sorry, has Leo Borealis sent another super chat?
Oh, did he? I didn't think so, but wait. Okay. Let me see if I missed anything else. Thank you so much. How about you read that? You can see it. Read it, AM.
All true on China, but remember that Europe has seen vast trade networks exist from the Arctic to the Nile to the Ural since the Neolithic. Long-range trade is old in Europe. And yes, that's true.
Right. Yes, long-range trade. And yeah, it's confusing. I remember I was in Beijing and seeing, what was it, the plan for a ship or a piece of a ship? Or actually, I'm going to leave that up. Was it an emperor or an explorer or something had, they think he actually went to the New World possibly, but certainly he went far.
Oh, that theory has been thoroughly debunked. It's going to really going to thoroughly irritate me because I've forgotten the name of the admiral. But yes, in the 1410s and 20s during the reign of Yongle, the Chinese visited East Africa. And the theory, I can't remember which book, but the theory is that they got as far as Cape Verde off the coast of West Africa, which was later a Portuguese colony. Yes, and someone in the chat, Zhang He, the eunuch who led this massive treasure fleet throughout the Indian Ocean during the beginning of the 15th century.
Right, and so, but the reaction, I think, was not to open up trade, but didn't they like smash the ships up or something?
It was fascinating. Well, I think this again represents the top-down nature of Chinese rule. Yongle wanted to establish tributaries. You know, the Chinese diplomatic history is, China is Zhongguo, which means the Middle Kingdom, and all other kingdoms have to pay homage to the center of the universe, which is the Ming Dynasty. So any sort of treaty with China involving trade had to rely on this tributary network. So it was basically to impress all of these smaller entities in India and East Africa, and bring them into the Ming sphere of influence. And then immediately after Yongle, there is basically this assessment: the Ming don't need to learn anything from these foreigners. We don't need interaction, so we're going to smash up our votes. Right.
So yeah, that idea quickly comes to an end, basically.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks again to Leo for a couple of super chats for this show. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.